Welcome to the Greenhouse Journal. I'm Mary, your host for the podcast segment of this student-run project. Today we'll be talking about the effects of climate change on incarcerated people. Calls to abolish prisons across the United States and Canada are becoming more prominent every day. After the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 highlighted the systemic inequities and violence suffered by Black and Brown communities, a plethora of articles explored a world in which the prison system and policing are abolished. The everyday citizen fails to imagine a world without police and incarceration, but the abolition movement wants people to picture a society that focuses on community support, especially when most crimes are committed because of income inequality. In an article for the HALT organization Law Directory, Suzette Alvarez lists the three most common criminal charges in Canada, most of them being low-stakes crimes such as breaking and entering, fraud, and assault. According to a study done by the Milton Park Citizens Committee, quote, Montreal's 2018 homeless count suggests that an Indigenous person on the island is around 27 times more likely to be homeless than a non-Indigenous person, and an Inuk is roughly 80 times more likely. End quote. The Canadian government's website states, quote, Indigenous inmates in federal institutions rose from 20% of the total inmate population in 2008 to 2009 to 28% in 2017-2018, while representing only 4.1% of the overall Canadian population. Similarly, the percentage of federally incarcerated Indigenous women rose from 32% of the female inmate population to 40%. End quote. Here is a segment of an interview I had with prison abolitionist Roxane Cornelier, further exploring the topics mentioned previously. What does prison abolition mean to you in a Canadian context? Because there's a lot of scholarship on the topic of American criminal institutions, but due to Canada's sanitized liberal persona, it does not receive any criticism for its treatment of incarcerated people. So how would you describe it?
That's a good question. I guess because there's a lot of scholarship on the American prison system, a lot of the scholarship, or a lot, even in symposium, we rely a lot on theories from the American context. But I think the bigger difference from the American context to the Canadian context is the percentage of Indigenous population in prison, which I don't think it's talked about enough. Everything was related to COVID. I don't know if you remember, but I think it was in 2022. There was a series of protests happening in prison here because the prisoners were held in solitary confinement under the guise of you have to isolate for COVID. But
And
it's just
solitary confinement is illegal here in Quebec.
yeah. So it was a series of protests. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think for me to be a prison abolitionist in Canada, it means reckoning with the intersection of policing in the communities, um, as well as the prison system here and how they intersect and the amount of funding that goes into policing community, especially Black communities, Indigenous communities, and going against the stereotypes of Canada being this benevolent nation and being so different from the United States, when in fact there's a lot of similarities.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting because recently our liberal arts program, which for some reason one of their law professors wanted to go visit a prison as one of their field trips. So they ended up going to the Archambault prison. The guard was talking to one of the students because they weren't allowed to talk with any of the incarcerated people. And they told one of our students that the way they would differentiate the prisoners, it would be they would talk about the Indigenous prisoners and they talk about the normal prisoners. And that's how they would reference it, talk about them. And so also one of the students asked if the prisoners can talk, they can try to pursue education in a high school diploma, but above that they have no option. So if a prisoner wanted to get their deck or anything more than that, they can't even do switch out of the institution. And
which is weird compared to US prisons, because I think in certain prisons in the US they have college programs and things like that. So it's when you're talking about sanitizing the prison system in Canada, you think okay, well here they're not allowed that education, but in the US they are. So it's each prison system has its own flaws. This isn't even my project. I'm just here for fun.
Yeah, that's especially what you said about like the like normal prisoners. I think that that sort of language especially is interesting when you consider because in my work I deal a lot with like theories about as like whiteness studies and like white supremacy and all like the language because I'm really interested in like the visual culture, but I think it still applies
Mhm.
to like sociology or even like literature. But the use of like white as like the universal implied
Hmm.
standard or like everything that is not white is not norm. Like seeing whiteness as the norm.
Hmm.
So that's really interesting. And then for the Canadian context, I will say also like relating to the housing market, because I feel like there's a lot of criminalization of homelessness.
Exactly, yeah.
And for some people, it's like easier to just like go back to prison than like because there's not enough support once you get out of prison. And so
Mhm.
sometimes the easiest like solution is to go back because you know that you'll have like a roof over your head, food,
Yeah, exactly.
and yeah.
I know this might be a question you get asked a lot, like as an abolitionist, but for people who know less about the topic, how does one reach a point in society which requires no policing and subsequently abolishing its brutal, like, prison system?
For now, it's hard to see um a possibility where like this is not where policing is not like at the center. And I think this is also I don't know, like being part of like the defund the police movement, especially in Montreal, like you start seeing how a lot of the money, like they get obnoxious budget, like, and it keeps going up every year, where like social service, social initiatives don't get as much. And it's just like having the first reaction when there's like a mental health crisis, having to call the cops is
Mhm.
just not the way to do it. But because we have been so conditioned to do that, and the what the society's built is on the dependence of the police to keep the population in check.
Mhm.
It's hard to imagine another way. Um, but yeah, I think it starts by, small acts. It is true that for now is more of a philosophy,
Mhm.
but I don't know. I think even not to be an optimistic, but especially with all the protests like going on right now, I think we can see that I don't know, people are starting to organize and to protest. And hopefully we'll see the inefficiency of relying too much on the police and the prison for like punitive systems.
There are clear correlations between incarceration, economic disparity, and racial bigotry, but what is less commonly known are the intersections of climate injustice and criminal justice. Since the carceral system in North America is based on retributive justice, the living conditions for most incarcerated people are horrendous and even dangerous. Other than the lack of proper health measures such as sanitation and nourishment, the location of 32% of state and federal prisons are located within 3 miles of extremely hazardous and polluted areas, according to research analyst Leah Wang. Wang says, quote, "These conditions manifest in health conditions and deaths that are unmistakably linked to those sites," end quote. One of America's most notorious and largest jails, Rikers Island, is made of, according to writer and community organizer Molly Lipson, quote, "landfill, much of which is coal ash and a byproduct of coal mining that is full of harmful toxins." In an article for Think Global Health titled "Climate Change and Incarceration," various authors state, quote, "Certain health conditions and prescription medications, including psychotropics, interfere with temperature regulation. Approximately 43% of people in prison reported a previous mental health diagnosis, and 66% reported taking prescription medication. What's more, evidence suggests to mortality risk, including suicide, increase with higher temperature. The Vera Institute of Justice identified increases in self-harm, aggression, and conflict coinciding with higher heat indexes." End quote. In a society which decides to turn a blind eye on the mistreatment of marginalized people, it is always important to look at what is not being talked about by mainstream media. I hope you learned something new today on the topics of environmental injustice and criminal justice, and how all systems of oppression intersect, even if we might not expect it. Thank you so much, and this is Mary signing out.